Hi, everyone. Welcome to this morning's panel group. We're going to be talking today about access versus inclusion. I'm really excited to have everybody here with us this morning, and I'd like to welcome you to doing a little morning dance with me. I know I can't see you. I hope you're joining me, just get the blood shaking and moving. If you didn't join me, that's on you. So I'm here today to introduce myself first, and we have two other people who are going to be joining us for this panel. So first of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about why am I here and why am I talking. My name is Cara Frank, and I am here to speak from the deaf perspective. And so I just want to give you a little more background on that. And because I was born deaf, that inspired me to work in the adaptive outdoor recreation industry for about 15 years, all throughout the Western region. And currently I work with Deschutes Land Trust as their outreach associate, which is based in Bend, Oregon, with their we conserve and care for land that continue to be the traditional lands of Native Americans. That includes the Warren Springs, Wasco, and Pilates tribe. And through the Land Trust, I help out with the tours, at-bats, and much more. It's a lot of fun. In addition to that, I am also the U.S. Deaf Ski Team Snowboard Director. And a lot of people may not be aware, there actually is an international Deaflympic, and that happens every 4 years. Our last Deaflympic was actually in Italy in 2019, which was right before COVID. So our timing was very fortunate. But it's a very inclusive experience that is just extraordinary. We have thousands of athletes from all over the world, like 34 countries, all competing in one place, sharing a love for the mountain and a love for the language, and just elevating, future leaders for the deaf community. So with all that said, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to sign language mode out of respect and in terms of equality for my deaf peers who may be watching. So from here out, you're going to be seeing a sign language interpreter voice and for me. One of our other presenters also deaf too as well. So we have two interpreters that will be carrying this out.
We'll also have you in groups today too, so we're going to have some technological challenges, I'm sure, with the virtual environment and the meeting and the platform that we're using. So we're going to be learning that as well today, and I recognize that there are many virtual platforms that may not always be the most deaf-friendly. How we've done that is that we'll be following each individual, and generally their pictures tend to get very small, and it's very hard on deaf individuals' eyes when they're trying to see these microscopic things on the screen. So we're going to be trying hard to manipulate the layout of the screen. So I just wanted to thank everyone in advance for all of your patience while we learn through this process and go through this journey together. So really, I want to prioritize and make sure that communication access for everyone is able to see, and also for those of you that are included in this presentation today. We're definitely going to be trying to add some information in the chat that you'll see, and we'd like to invite you to go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. Tell us who you are, tell us your name, tell us your background and your field and why you're joining us here today. We might learn some things as we go along. And I also encourage you to feel that if you have any questions or you're curious or you have a thought that pops up, go ahead and type that in the chat and feel free to include that, and we'll do our best to try to catch those comments and those thoughts as we go along. So today's topic is regarding access versus inclusion. And we're going to be talking about the difference between those terms, about physical access and how that evolves and advances to become inclusion. So our goal is to really share our lives and our lived experiences as people with disabilities and people who work in our fields and working toward equality and inclusion with the outside, in the outdoor recreation. So again, please feel to type a comment, and I invite all of our first presenters to join us now on the screen to introduce themselves as well. So if you wouldn't mind coming on screen, and we'll learn more about who you are, and you can show us your morning dance when you get here and why you're here today, and share that with us. So Sachiko, if you want to go ahead, and we'll start with you. Yes, hi, my name is Sachiko, and I go by Sko. This is my name sign. So yeah, I am the co-founder of CorpsTHAT, and we signed for that for that organization. And it's an organization that is combining the outdoor industry and deaf individuals with three main prongs: outdoor education, recreation, and work development. So I also work, I have another hat. I am the co-executive director for Deaf World. We call it DW. And there's another woman who organizes that. She focuses on the community and job development skills in another country. So this morning, we're here. So it's better if we sign. So this is my happy dance. So it's better to use my hands for my happy dance. This is my version of the happy dance, to warm up my hands today and my fingers to get ready for it. Thanks so much, Sachiko. I appreciate that. And Ashley, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, thanks for being here, everyone. I do the shoulder dance, and it helps my shoulders unwind a little bit. I am a wheelchair user. I kind of forget that Zoom doesn't, or not Zoom, but these online platforms don't show my experience. I'm very used to it being the first thing people notice about me. So I just wanted to let you know that's my lens and why I'm here today. But my pronouns are she, her. I live in Bend, which is the Warm Springs tribe. But I'm currently in Salt Lake, going out to Moab for some adventuring, so doing this on the road. And so for Salt Lake, it's the Deschutes and the Eastern Shoshone tribes and their land. I think later on we're doing a second panel, and I want to talk a little bit more about land acknowledgements there. And not take up as much time in this one. But I am the owner, founder of Empowering Access. I do disability and inclusion consulting. Our thing is from lived experience. So Cara is also one of the consultants that I hire. And so I usually bring around like 5 to 9 different people with different disability lenses out to sites or to programs to do assessments and give people recommendations, help with strategic planning, all those different kinds of things, because I have a background in women's studies and architecture, and through those kind of educational lenses, realize that, you know, what's really missing in these fields is lived experience. You know, people's experiences are just being assumed a lot of times, and I think that's how we've ended up with a lack of inclusion and access. And so I'm trying to kind of find my way around that and see how I can most serve my community and kind of bridge that gap. So that's who I am. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for both of you for introducing yourselves and joining us today. Really, I've known both of you for several years now, and I really look forward to seeing their growth and development over the years. And both of you are, you know, one-woman shows in your own right. So I applaud your work and your effort for that. Happy to see you here today and talk about that more, right? So yeah, it seems like we have a lot of people who are typing in the chat. So thank you so much for letting us know more about who you all are. And I appreciate looking at all the comments. Maybe we have some questions about access and access for children and beyond. So please, yes, definitely keep that up in the chat, and we'll try to catch all of those comments as we go along. So because of some of our technological challenges with this video, this format, this platform, we're not always able to include our PowerPoint slides on the screen at the same time. So we're going to be referring to the slides, but hopefully you'll be able to share some of that information as we go along. So really, we're just going to get started with the burning questions here in the beginning and set up our topic of access versus inclusion today.
Okay, so what is access? That's the first question I've got for the two of you. What is access? And what are some common misconceptions that come with access? What are those misconceptions, and what have you two experienced when it comes to access? Any sort of challenges or struggles? And how can people communicate more effectively when talking about access? I'll turn it over to y'all. Ashley, you want to start?
Sure.
Go back and forth.
Yeah. And, feel free to interrupt me and jump in at any time. But I think the biggest misconception with access versus inclusion is, so often we think that the ADA is access and inclusion. It's kind of the overruling thing on access. And it's just this big, terrifying orb that is a lot of regulations and a lot of money and a lot of time and everything. And so it kind of tends to feel like a burden, which I think kind of then lands on what accessibility and accommodation and inclusion and all of those things look like, which is kind of a shame, which I think is why we wanted to talk about the difference between access and inclusion and kind of let people know that there's a difference and that there can be work done in both departments that will advance accessibility. Because although an ADA bathroom is absolutely necessary, a quarter-mile paved trail isn't the most inclusive for everyone. It is for some people, but also trying to recognize that disability is a huge bubble, huge umbrella of different abilities and desires and needs. And so what the ADA covers is a very narrow view of what disability is. And oftentimes that can mean people are kind of left out because they're only being looked at with this one lens. And we're not having a bigger discussion about what people actually want and what makes them feel included in a space.
Yeah, and I like to add to what Ashley said, that access, when I think of access, the first thing that comes to mind is usually physical access. And I think that's the first thing for many people. So ramps, having elevators, having vans that have, drop-down ramps for wheelchair access. But a lot of times we forget about communication. Often as a deaf person, people forget me. The access is not given, so things are not presented in sign language. And being deaf has a huge range. There are some people that use hearing aids, cochlear implants, they can speak. There are some people that use sign language as their primary form of communication, and that can make things more complicated. When using ASL, some people prefer signed exact English. Some people prefer more ASL grammatical structure. Some people use international sign language. So there's a lot of different considerations when you're talking about access. And that's something that I've seen come up a lot, is that communication is forgotten about. One example of access is platforms that we're using. So right now, this virtual platform that we're using, we've got 4 videos on. If we were at a PowerPoint, we wouldn't be able to see the interpreter anymore. So is that accessible? No? We need to make visual accessibility something that we consider, from the ground up. When you're hosting an event, online, accessibility, visual accessibility needs to be in the considerations, and we need to have discussions about what that's going to look like.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of that requires planning ahead of time, and that also goes for physical access, that, just following ADA guidelines for a physical ramp or something is kind of late to the show. I think access in all different ways and inclusive access means that we're starting from the way that we're designing, the way that we're having conversations about, things we're hosting or things we want to build or sites, and starting from the top, starting in our organization before it even breaks ground.
Do the two of you often feel like accessibility is just a checklist that people go through? All the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And could you tell us more? Can you give us some examples about that, about what you look for? Sure. So one thing that I notice in the checklist is if we've got an interpreter. visual access right there. That's something I'm looking for, and that shows me that they're thinking about deaf people. But is the interpreter high quality? You know, should they be doing this job? Sometimes that's a box that's not checked. Are we including people of color? Have we looked to get representation in all different communities? That's another one on the checklist, because sometimes you'll bring in someone and people will say, oh, that's enough. But really, if you want to include communities, there's more that you have to do to truly do that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think oftentimes I see just a bathroom or, like I said, a quarter-mile paved trail to a really beautiful place, and and then there's rocks and all sorts of things in the way on the trail that I could go on if there just were some things cleared. And then I think because we're in a moment of so much change and people like self-awareness, trying to do better and recognize things, which I acknowledge is very hard to learn about everything. We're doing a lot of unlearning right now, and that takes a lot of time, and there's no rushing. But I think out of that has become this box of representation, like Sko was talking about, that that's a quick box that we can take someone, a person of color or someone in a chair, and put them in our marketing information, and we're being inclusive. But the reality is, unless you actually know of a inclusive trail or have resources to provide or have done the work behind the scenes, it's really misleading. And so, the people that are actually intended to be included are actually kind of excluded. And it's really just more of a performative thing for everyone else, and to feel like we're doing something, because I think we can get so uncomfortable with how slow things move that we have this urge to make something happen immediately. And that's something that can happen immediately, but we need to slow down. I've learned that lesson lately. I think everyone is that we just need to slow down and do things right. So avoid check boxes at all costs.
Yeah, I agree. I think the theme I've seen is we need to start at the top and work our way down. Oh, excuse me. I've seen a trickle down system with accessibility, and that's a problem where everything is assumed to be trickling down. But what we really need to do is build that pyramid from the foundation and share information, share resources. And it shouldn't be a trickle down. It should be everyone's on the same level, on the same page, sharing things. And I think that's something that the communities need to discuss more. How to build accessibility, but work towards inclusion and what that looks like. So that's going to lead us to our next question, our next slide. That is focusing on inclusion. So what is inclusion, and how can we elevate inclusion in our land management? So if the two of you could share some examples, share some experiences that you've had, maybe some examples of working with organizations in your local area, that would be great. Oh, Scott? Sure, all right. So when you talk about the pyramid model and changing that to something that is equal for everyone, the challenging part is society. Unfortunately, we are expected to meet society instead of society meeting us where we're at. So oftentimes, people who are disabled, deaf, anyone within this disability bubble has to work to meet society instead of the other way around. And if people want to be truly inclusive of people with disabilities, people who are deaf, then it requires planning beforehand, discussion beforehand, working with the community beforehand to understand what the community wants to see developed. So if you work for an organization or a company that wants to be more inclusive, you need to talk to that community first to see what they can do to elevate that. Does that make sense? Sorry, I'm trying to get a few points in here. I just want to make sure that's clear for everyone. Yes. I think, you know, you're talking about building partnerships between different communities. Yep. I'm working on doing that. Yes.
Yeah.
Ashley, you want to add?
I think inclusion, you know, often, I had a thought and I totally lost it. Cara, you want to add something? I need a moment.
Okay, sure. So one example, I'll share an example of inclusion. So at the Deaflympics, you know, we work with hearing people, and many of them don't know sign language, but it's still inclusive. And we make sure that the platform, though, is tailoring to deaf people. So if we have team meetings, if beforehand we're going to be meeting with people who are hearing, we'll have our courses worked out. We'll figure it out what the mountain's going to look like, and then we'll get all together to explain what it's going to look like, the elements, the challenges of the mountain, and we'll also have an interpreter there. In our audience, we have a mix of deaf people. And for example, sometimes there are coaches in the audience, and there might be someone speaking, and we might have, you know, staff who is speaking, who is hearing, and then also having that interpreted. So the coaches in the audience are going to get the information first, because the interpreter is always 2 or 3 seconds behind. The hearing coaches will get that information first before the deaf people in the audience. So what we do is we expect the hearing people to wait before they make decisions or actions until the interpreter is done, meaning everyone has the same information. No one can start raising hands or jumping in before the interpreter is done, and the deaf people have the same access to that information. So once that happens, then everyone can start having their discussion. And that's the way that you can elevate a platform, because it's easy for hearing people to just start talking when information is given, as opposed to waiting for the interpreter. So deaf people have that same information. And it's also giving people, you know, a chance to slow down, to think about things and how they'll be set up, think about logistics of the course, and requires people to take more time, a little bit more energy to have full discussions to make sure everything is inclusive. Ashley, did you want to add?
Yeah, okay. So what I was thinking about, like, I caught something when Sko was talking, and then I got absorbed and I lost it. But just talking about language and that planning ahead thing, you know, I used to look at inclusion a lot differently, and how, you know, the result of planning and design, but more these days I'm looking at, you know, the work that people are doing behind the scenes, and a lot of the committees I've been on and focus groups and things. There's been a lot of opportunities to kind of to talk about language, and I think Sko was saying that, you know, the thing, it's kind of like it's always put on the deaf person or the disabled person, the wheelchair user, the responsibility of things, and how that kind of looks for like a wheelchair user, is that my body is always kind of the barrier. You know, it's seen as the challenge, and some ways that that kind of is communicated is in documents and stuff that people are working through to be more inclusive. They say things about, like, let me know if you have challenges, or you know, it's always put on the person's body rather than acknowledging that the environment is the barrier. And so that's something for me when I look at something and they're trying to be inclusive and they call out, you know, like, we want to help people, you know, disabled people, or they never say that. It's always something that kind of, I think, avoids the word disability, and which is another interesting topic. But you know, the idea that it's my body that's broken, when it's not, because literally everything in our world is designed. Everything that we're looking at right now, everything. And so we all had a choice in that, you know? And so when we don't build access into that, that's automatically excluding. And so when we use language that, you know, puts the person's body as the barrier, then that like continually like perpetuates that. And so having conversations about like what the true barrier is within our organization, talking about it in that way, and you know, communicating to people that we, you know, we have these barriers. How can we accommodate? How can we, you know, fix those barriers for you? I think that's a huge one, and that's just been in my world lately, being a consultant and on a lot of, you know, committees and things. But like, I think examples for like outdoor and the physical things when I feel included in a space, is when, you know, okay, a big one that like is definitely more physical, when instead of gravel, there's like decomposed granite or something, and I didn't have to tell anyone. That's amazing. You know, those are some of the physical things. Or the bathroom like truly considers everything. Like the hotel I'm staying in right now is the most accessible one I've ever been in. And if you've ever known anyone with a disability, they're never accessible, ever. So, you know, I acknowledge that access and inclusion do overlap. And a lot of times the way that happens is when physical access happens without having to ask someone or tell someone to do something, when you can tell that they really listened and they did their research. That's the big part of it, is that you can tell that they did the work.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, Ashley. And I think the wording sometimes in language is everything. And sometimes, you know, I'll approach the environment where people want to kind of dance around the wording, and that certain words are taboo and you can't say that. And it's, you know, it's such a waste of time to dance around it, when, you know, it's such a better way to just approach it directly and join with each other to do that and be direct. So the well intentions will be recognized. I mean, you can build from that. But yeah, it's really, I wanted to add a little bit more about the physical accessibility piece. And I wanted to give Sachiko an opportunity to chime in once or twice when she had some comments, when she wanted to add to what Ashley had mentioned. Yes, I did have a thought. So there was one thing that recently, there was an event that really impacted me. And this was about a month ago. There was an event that was hosted. It was a celebration, and there was like a festival of some sort related to outdoor experiences. And there were a lot of discussions happening on what that would look like and how the interpreter would be placed. And it seemed like everything was well worked out. And then as we approached the day of the event, they said, no, we're actually going to drop that. We don't need the interpreters. And I said, why? I asked why. And they said that they had asked around to people who were involved with the different participants, and they said nobody requested an interpreter, so I don't think we need them. And I said, I was just shocked. I was stunned. I said, well, you know, we did all of this planning and I explained everything, and they were so supportive of it in the moment. And then when the time came for it, they said, no, we don't need it. I was honestly really disheartened. So I was like, this includes me. So, you know, we got close to the event, and one of the interpreters was placed on stage. That, you know, it's not just beneficial for the deaf people, it's for hearing people too, to show, you know, the things that get overlooked. So, you know, participants with autism or people who have a different range of visual experiences or understandings using visual information, they can benefit from that as well. It's not just deaf individuals that use that. So that was one thing I found myself nodding along to what Ashley was mentioning regarding her hotel experience. You know, it's so many other things and blunders that get made. And that event that just happened to me recently really struck home when you were talking about that. I mean, this is 2021 and it's still a process. We're still facing these same issues. So yeah, it's, you know, it's all the time. But I'm sure Ashley and there are other people that, you know, are all fighting for this, for accessibility and inclusion. And it's, you know, so with this platform, hopefully we're able to spread some more information and figure out how to accommodate programs to be more inclusive. So yes, I think it's so important to building those partnerships, and you know, how important it is to really dialogue with people who have those lived disability experiences, not just someone who says that they're experts, but, you know, someone who has no lived experience can't quite possibly give the same point of view. So the assumptions of others often is so detrimental. And Sachiko, you know, for something like this, it's, you know, it's America. It's, you know, generally speaking, you know, using gestures and things like that is kind of frowned on. People do a lot of pointing and they think that's a weird thing. So, you know, I think we need to really push, you know, to get beyond that and just go ahead and normalize making gestures and gesturing to someone. For me personally, when I'm traveling in other countries, it's almost easier to get along with people who speak other languages because they're already in the habit of the custom of using gestures. And, you know, when there's a spoken language barrier, they already know how, and they have that experience to know how to just get along. So really, yeah, I think it's, yeah, we could talk about this so much more, but, you know, in the interest of time, I think we're going to go ahead and get on with our next slide. But we can talk about this, about the issue of inclusion. What we're looking for is a little bit more to dig a little deeper and say, you know, organizations that want to work on their inclusivity, how can they advance that? How can they build on that? And what are some of the successes that you both have had in the past in your businesses on bolstering that and encouraging inclusivity?
Well,
Ashley?
Yeah, I think, you know, some of the successes we've had have really been when we get into a group with our client, it's usually like a handful of people from, for example, we've been assessing a lot of camps that do like outdoor school and everything. And we get into a group with the client and, you know, just tell them that they can ask anything and let them know that, you know, they'll make mistakes and we all do. And just to see them kind of like, you know, deflate a little and like not be so concerned and able to just get things out there, the questions that they have, you know, and in a like non-judgmental space, and be able to have real conversations with them to kind of break down those barriers and be able to just talk blatantly about what exists and not be worried about offending anyone has been, I think, really empowering for not only the client, but also us as like a team. Has been pretty amazing to see the reaction of these camps and how eager they are to do the work. And then afterwards to hear like how excited they are to do the work, you know, because we're giving them kind of things at all levels to focus on and to get started on. And they're just excited because they feel like it's something they can tackle and it's not, you know, $200,000 ADA project. It's, you know, simple maintenance or website stuff, or, you know, it happens on so many different levels. So there's been a lot of success in just kind of working through those communication barriers and the fear and anxiety that comes along with all of it, and has been super validating for me as a business owner to realize that, you know, people really not only want this work, but are really relieved when they have people with lived experience to tell them, you know, what they need directly, and to give them that space to figure it out and to fumble is huge. I didn't, you know, I didn't know what I was doing really. I was just kind of winging it, hoping that it would work out with all of my skills, that something, and it happened to work out. So it's pretty encouraging to see people's reactions. I hope that answers the question. I kind of zoned out a little when you were talking.
No, that was perfect. That was perfect. And Sachiko, I know, would you expand a little bit more about CorpsTHAT and some of the things that you've done in terms of inclusion? Yeah, so really, okay. So CorpsTHAT is, it's been running for 5 years now. And inclusion, it's always tricky. That's the tricky part for deaf people. So thinking about, you know, if there's one organization that's really motivated and they want to do more inclusion of ASL, and maybe they have a Spanish translator, but they want to do ASL as well. So, you know, we're happy to consult with them and talk to them about it. One thing that, like Cara just mentioned, dancing around the language, right? So that tends to be another issue. Other people tend to dance around money. That's another issue that comes up that is tricky. So we tell them about the interpreters and what it takes to be inclusive, and they're always a little bit shocked at, you know, interpreters are expensive. And said, well, yes. I said, translation is not easy. It's so yes, it's an expensive thing, but depending on the state where you live, rates of interpreters can vary a lot. So, for example, in my case, I work predominantly in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. So, and they charge differently than somewhere out on the West Coast, like Oregon or Washington State. You're going to have different rates regionally. So I explained to them that yes, and we can try to figure something out. And the interpreters bill by the hour, or they bill by like a flat fee, perhaps. So we can talk about pricing structures. And I've noticed that that's one thing that keeps coming up. Inclusion, we can talk about it, and I'm directly a deaf person giving this information, consulting with them directly. And always in the back of my mind, there's the habit that they will often look at the interpreter and they'll ask the interpreter for feedback. As a hearing person, I'm like, hi, I'm over here. I'm deaf and I've been signing my whole life. I'm right here. The interpreter just learned sign language as an adult, maybe half of their lives. Or maybe they just learned a few years ago. I'm the expert on this language here. Please don't refer to my interpreter. So, and then they'll start, they'll come back to talking to me, but they feel like they have to invite another interpreter to talk about it at the meeting, and that they prefer to speak to someone who's hearing about it. And I end up getting left out of that conversation, that discussion. So that's a challenge when you're talking about inclusivity and what that means, and bringing a hearing person as an expert on that disability to talk to them about it they're not the expert. They're just not. So even though they're paid to do it. So that's one thing that we have to stop, is that, that the equation of the expertise with hearing status. And because they're having that visual communication, that discussion about it. But that's been my experience. Ashley, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I think that happens very often in my world, and it's a hard one. I think oftentimes organizations that serve the disabled community are often asked, and I definitely, am guilty of giving out them as recommendations, because they have a lot of knowledge and everything, and their experience and lens around disability is very valid and very useful. I think sometimes it becomes like a crutch. I don't know if that's the right term to use. A lot of rethinking our language these days, but people tend to lean on that, and instead of putting in the effort to find someone with the actual disability that they're talking about, to give a presentation, or to help them with a design or something, and so it ends up being someone who's not disabled talking about people with disabilities, because yes, they have a lens that they've done a lot of work accommodating people with a really wide variety of disabilities, and I definitely see value in that. But I think we need to reassess, and maybe when those opportunities happen, have someone with a disability also there. It needs to be in combination, because I don't want to discount their value and the experience they have serving people with disabilities, but I also don't want that to become like a checked box as well. I think that happens very often, that they're just called, and also they're busy. They're nonprofits most of the time, and it takes a lot for them to put in that work. So I think we need to be aware of kind of the labor that it's taking from everyone, and be including people with disabilities more, and from different stages. And we'll talk more about resources and things in our next presentation that happens later, but there's all sorts of consultants and things and people that we can go to, and the information can be hard to find, but it's out there, and that's why we're doing these presentations. It's to kind of help out with that. I think another point I wanted to hit on from what Sko was talking about is kind of commitment, talking about what a shock it is to find out how much it costs for interpreters. And for me, that kind of signals to where people are at in the work. I think one of the first things that needs to happen when an organization is looking to do work around access is there needs to be a commitment. I think they need to formally write it out. It's kind of like doing a business plan or something. We need to set our intentions, and commitment needs to be a part of that, is to understanding the access isn't easy, because we've built so much inaccessibility, you know, that we, you know, we're really at a phase that we've kind of dug ourselves a deep hole here. And it's going to take a lot of work, like many other things, all of these other communities that have been marginalized and left out. It's going to take us a lot of work to dig out of this hole. And the biggest thing is commitment and realizing that, yes, we're going to have to put funds towards this. Yes, we're going to have to put time, and it's going to feel like we're taking from these other groups. But in reality, like, these groups have been left out for so long that they deserve that time. And, you know, we really need to kind of switch that energy a little bit and be ready for it. Otherwise it will be that shocking moment. And then that leaves the person like Sco feeling left out because they're not considering them. And, you know, that doesn't feel good. Like, Sco put in a lot of effort into that. And then to have them just, you know, all of a sudden be like, oh, we don't need it, is just like, you weren't really listening and you weren't really committed. And so, yeah, there's a lot of work that happens ahead of time. I'm noticing this theme that we're all like, do the work prior.
Yeah, do the work prior. I definitely agree. And I noticed that echoing in what we've been saying earlier too about the pyramid and that trickle down and trying to flatten that pyramid to make it a level playing field with resources and everything else. So with the community, and, you know, we are each other's best resources in many ways. So, and it's not fun to be seen as, you know, like a money grabbing, the face of money. Every time where we approach, people see dollar signs. So that's something we can think about. I think it's interesting too, from a deaf perspective, that often the most common discussion that happens around communication and language, but it's not always about language, really. It's also physical barriers as well, sometimes for deaf individuals. For example, it's small things, but really, you know, if that happens over and over again, it can cumulatively add up. So for example, like sitting in rows, if the room is set up where all the chairs are set in rows and there are tables that are rectangularly shaped, where there are a couple people on each side, it's really hard to see people that's on the other end of that table sitting on the same side that you are, because there's a physical barrier. You've got to crane your head to see who's talking. So really, there's so much empowerment in how you set up your physical space, and sitting in circles versus in rows, and taking down those barriers so that there's a visual line of sight to everyone. And, you know, you can scan the room better to see what's going on. Ashley and I were having a similar conversation. We had this before, where talking about the need for wider rows for wheelchair accommodations. And it's also true for deaf and hard of hearing people, because it empowers us to be able to sit across from each other and have more space to see each other, instead of being in a line where you can't see each other. So yeah, visual access and visual line of sight, and having the space to do that when you're in a line is, you know, it's so different. The exchanges of how we accommodate and manipulate the physical space has benefits. So. And Sco, yes, I just wanted to add to what Cara said about communication and being in rows. So having narrow line queue spaces, trails. So people that are out there have mentioned, you know, being in the trails, deaf people have no idea what's going on ahead of them. So you've got to wait until you can get to a space. You're walking along, and then you can group up and get in a circle and talk about what you've seen or what you've experienced on that trail. But when you're walking in a line single file like that, it's fascinating how people think that, you know, because it's based on an auditory preference, you know, of having a visual preference, that, you know, you're not used to being in the quiet. So walking single file in the quiet is really interesting. Gives you time to absorb it and think things, and then when you get to your destination, you can huddle up and talk to each other, but you have to hold on to that. So it's a benefit for deaf people, but it's also a benefit for hearing people too, to calm their minds and wait until we get somewhere to talk about things. Yeah, I think that's so empowered, the power of nature and the diversity in nature, so that we can just calm down and be and observe and see everything. That's a really reflection of us in nature, in a ways, in a very abstract way. But yeah, that's a discussion for another time. So really, in your experiences, when you've been looked at to get involved with when you've been looking to get involved in something and you want more information, maybe you're looking for someone with experience with an organization, and you're looking at their programming, or, you know, any of that. What are some of the things that you can do to make sure that they have access to information?
Okay, we'll start with Ashley.
Okay. I think, access to information is a really big one that I am recommending to literally everyone I talk to that does anything with land management and trails and all those kinds of things. I often give the example that Google Street View is my best friend as a wheelchair user. Anytime I'm going to a business establishment, I look to make sure there's not steps to get in. And so being able to use that resource to look ahead means that, well, for one thing, it helps with my anxiety. I'm a very anxious person. And so being able to, see that, then I can go to the space and not feel like I'm excluded. Like I immediately feel included when there is, no step there, and then so I recommend to everyone, and I've been, pushing for all the organizations to come up with, some sort of a way to do some sort of 360 view. That's a technology that is pretty available these days. And so on our websites and things, so for like state parks or Forest Service, we generally have maps of things and where camps are and all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't have a lot of information on what access looks like. It'll say like ADA, pit toilet or something, but that's it. And, for me, it's like, I'm not going to a destination for a toilet. Like, I want to know whether or not the trail is accessible. And if there's not information specifics on the trail that are addressing my needs, then there needs to be something else, and there's typically not great photos. I found better photos on Google Maps from just random people that have posted their photos of sites that, the organization's not even having to do, but just from like crowdsourcing, people are posting photos. So I end up like scouring those to see if things are accessible. But, if the organization were able to do 360 video of things or any kind of video, any kind of just acknowledgement of what their site looks like and how difficult it is, that's huge, because then I don't feel like I waste my time. Also, like if we're talking maps, like a way to search accessible things, because it's like so time consuming to look at something and try to do your own research and not find anything. Like, how do you find out if something's going to be accessible, or if you're going to get there, drive however long? Like if you live in Portland, everything is automatically like 45 minutes out, or longer, and you get there and it's just not accessible. Like that sucks. And so how do you kind of think of that ahead of time and give people those resources? I think that's part of the commitment, is we need to put that as a priority to start with our websites and the information we're putting out ahead of time, because access when you have a physical disability is the pre-planning. So much of my life goes into planning what I'm going to do, not only around a bathroom, but am I going to be able to do anything when I get there? So that would be my biggest thing, is website.
And to add to access of information from the deaf perspective, I'm also dependent on Google. It is my best friend as well. For events, for example, if something's going to be held at the park, are they going to have an ASL interpreter there or not? Who can I ask to request an interpreter? Where can I find that information? And oftentimes I'm looking and looking and looking till I can finally find an email, and then I get referred to someone else and referred to someone else. And by the time we get there, they say, sorry, it's now a last minute request. We're not able to meet that. Or there's these and/or things, that happen, with requesting interpreters. A lot of times people say, well, I've never done that before and I don't know how. And luckily, because I'm a business owner, I do know how to make these requests. I do that often, but I'm able to assist them in that. But there are a lot of deaf people who've never had to request an interpreter for themselves, and they don't know where to then guide people and give them those resources, to get that all worked out. And it shouldn't be their responsibility, that a lot of times an organizer is saying, what agency should I contact? Who should I go through? And that's not the deaf person's responsibility. They need to be researching and figuring out agencies and organizations beforehand to provide that. That's the work they have to do, especially if it's a federal agency. They already have contracts with interpreting agencies, and people just don't realize that. So something that can be asked is, do you have a contract with an agency? And if not, You can contract with an agency or get in touch with a freelance interpreter. But it's important to also check to make sure that the interpreter is qualified. Also, if they're going to be standing in the sun all day, is that something they're able to do? Are they able to join on a hike on the trails if that's required? Do they have the requirements to meet this job? And then also education is so important. One thing that often comes up in videos is lack of captions. A lot of times videos will be there and they might be beautiful videos with lots of visuals, but there's no captions, so then the deaf audience doesn't know what's being said. And it's that lack of awareness. Providing open captions or closed captions is so important. Open captions means that there's captions on every video regardless if there's a request, and that is beneficial for everyone, not just deaf people. On websites, if you're posting information, vlogs, TikTok videos, social media things, anything on Instagram, Facebook, anything like that, I'm asking that people please add captions to everything you do. Please, it's a little extra work, but it includes a huge audience that you've been leaving out. These captions are so important. I know that sometimes it's not easy. It requires extra work for people, but the deaf people are also always doing that extra work, and it's time for able people to take on that responsibility. So that's something easy that people can do to make things more accessible.
Agreed. I've been doing a lot of trying to post things, and it's incredible how much work it is to add in that accessibility feature. And and my hope is that we can put pressure on these social media platforms to build more access into their things, because it's like putting it all on the person with the disability to kind of come up with a solution and to advocate for their needs in it. Because on Instagram, for example, there's image descriptions, there's alt text, there's closed captioning, and it's not easy to do any of it. It takes a lot of work to kind of find the reach around, because it's not direct on that platform in any way. And, so that's another thing that people can do, is be putting pressure and really like requiring that, saying that that's a, important thing to your organization, and finding a way to make that happen.
Oh, I just thought of something else. Go ahead, Sko. So one thing related to captions, and I want to clarify and emphasize, automatic captions are not great. So I want to emphasize it's the manual captions that people type in. A lot of times if you go on Zoom or other platforms with events, they have automatic captions. And those automatic captions, I'm sure people have seen, a lot of times they're maybe 70% accurate, and then there's a lot of mistakes. So for example, my name, Sachiko, if that's spoken, are the automatic captions going to be able to spell that right? Probably not. So I'd like to emphasize it's the manual captions, not the automatic ones, that we're looking for accuracy and accessibility. Thank you for adding that, Sko. I was actually going to add that, so I'm glad that you said that. We're definitely on the same page. Yeah, automatic captions are just... people say, it's just a one-time, it was a one mistake that happened, but this is my life every day trying to access things like this. So it does make it a challenge, and it would be nice if people really did the work. Be a true ally, have accurate captions. Last week on the local news, there was a story about a deaf person, but they didn't provide captions in their video that was about a deaf person. They didn't even, I couldn't even understand what was happening, what happened in this news story, because captions weren't provided. And it was a story about a deaf person. So it's just things like that really hurt, this lack of awareness and lack of thinking of people. So if you go on your social media, your websites, there are so many things that are not accessible if you actually start paying attention to it. Start looking for captions, and you're going to notice how many things are not accessible, and then you'll notice the ones that are. And that's something that we have to do every day. It's just constantly reminding people. And it can't be a one-time reminder. It has to be consistent, because these are people's lives every day trying to get this accessibility. So I'd like to talk about websites, go back to that, and transparency on websites as well. what would that look like? Maybe, having an accessibility tab on your website, or what would that look like?
Well, I lately, actually, super relevant, there's a co-working space that I go to in Bend, and they've been doing a lot of work. It's been amazing. The Haven, if anyone's in Bend, they're great, go to them. But they've been doing a lot of work to make more accessibility, and so they came to me because I'm a member there and asked me, knowing what I do, also offering compensation, key important thing when you're asking people for this kind of work. But they've really been, asking me what to do on it. And I had a meeting with them and they really listen. I've told a lot of people to add an accessibility tab to their websites, like front and center, and that is a big ask to a lot of people, and it shouldn't be. I think access is, like Cara and Sko have said, it's our everyday, and it's really labor intensive when we have to dig for all of these things. And there's so many things in our world that are excluding that when we see one hint of it, we will abandon ship, because it's not worth our time, because we go through so many things. So it might seem easy, like, oh, well, they can just search the website. Yeah, but we're doing this constantly. And if there's any way that you can make it easier and make people feel included immediately, it needs to happen at this point. And that's what this group is doing, is that they're not only putting an accessibility tab at the top, underneath their drop down, it's at the bottom, it's in another location, and then it has its own page. And it talks about the site, it clearly describes their space and gives even a virtual tour. They did the 360 thing, which is awesome. And then it acknowledges their barriers. And it talks about what barriers do exist. I know a lot of people don't want to call out the negative, but for us, it's just a reality. We need to know about the barriers, sometimes more so than the accessible things. If there's an accessible thing, but it's over a log, I need to know about that log, and so it's really just call it out. I mean, for one thing, that starts a line of communication and a relationship. It promotes trust, it builds that trust, and it takes away the anxiety when I know that someone's listening to me and sees me, and so they're willing to just air it out, because that's the reality of our lives. Our lives are messy, and go ahead and just say it, and so that's the biggest thing, is that they're willing to actually call out what exists and what they need to work on, and that they also make it very visible, no shame in any of it. It's just a fact.
Yeah, transparency is very important. Looking at a website and seeing if it's easy to find information. Seeing if it's easy to find the specific person that I need to contact to find this information, instead of having to go through 3 different people and being told I'll get a call back. It's exhausting. So transparency is critical. And it's not going to turn me off, this transparency, if people are telling me things. It's showing me that people are interested in developing a relationship and having that conversation. Sko, did you want to add something? Yeah, having accessibility in a tab or in a toolkit. That way, if there's being able to zoom on a website, or being able to do color contrast for people who have visual barriers. That's very important to include as well. So there's many different features you have to think about when you think about accessibility, and I always try and recommend that to website designers. When you're building a new website, it's important to contact people who are the experts in accessibility in website design. And again, I'd like to emphasize, if you're able to provide accommodations, it should be easy. There should be just one click with a form to fill out, instead of me searching this website, trying to find someone and being referred to different people. It should be easy. Gaining accommodation should be simple. It doesn't have to be hard. It should be something easy that we can work out quickly. And if, for example, the company has a video phone. You know, if you're using a relay service with a sign language interpreter, hearing people can make a phone call, and it can go through an interpreter to call a deaf person, which is great. But if you've got a video phone, that can go straight to a deaf person who maybe works at your agency or organization. Include that phone number. That would be wonderful. And include the video phone number. That way, deaf people are provided direct communication if you do have a deaf employee there. So make that phone number accessible and easy to find. And that's one thing with technology. You know, technology has been evolving and advancing, and video phones have really empowered the deaf community. You know, I use my video phone every day to make phone calls, so I'm really happy that you mentioned that. Because, you know, sometimes sometimes we need to make phone calls, and the other person might think it's spam because it's an interpreter calling, and then they'll hang up on me. So then I have to call again, and that you kind of have to have patience with it as people are learning it. You can't. It's important though. Don't make assumptions. If you hear something that kind of maybe sounds like spam, just wait. You have to see who's on the other end of the call, because it might be a deaf person calling you just going through a relay service. I do want to let the audience watching know that we really want to encourage any questions you may have, any things you're thinking about. Please go ahead and put that in the chat. We're getting close to the end of our time together, so I'd like to take that opportunity just to address anything that people are thinking about right now. It looks like someone's wondering about being more transparent with language. So for example, is it okay to say disabled? Is it okay to say deaf? You know, if you're getting referred to someone who's in a wheelchair, what language are we looking for there? So let's start with Sco. Well, I think it's very important to be transparent and just ask the person what terms and language they're comfortable with. You know, and it's important to follow politically correct terms. So for example, people may think that hearing impairment is a politically correct term, but just an FYI to everyone, it is not. Deaf is the politically correct term. Hearing impairment implies that there's a brokenness, an impairment, which there's not. You know, whether someone is deaf or hard of hearing, I'm not broken. That's not how I see myself. Deaf people don't see themselves as broken. So hearing impairment is a term we don't use anymore. It is important to clarify between deaf as capital D or deaf as lowercase d, because a capital D deaf means that person is culturally deaf, and that implies a whole culture and community. Smaller d requires maybe just the medical look on deafness, you know, someone who has a hearing loss but doesn't culturally identify as deaf. You know, in America, deaf people in America don't consider themselves part of the disabled community. Disabled community has a wide range of needs. The deaf community is more specific to their needs. It's more visual access. It's captions, but there's a whole culture included there that's a little bit different from the disabled community. So that's why we do talk about the deaf and disabled community. And I want to be respectful and not make assumptions. It's important to be respectful and not make assumptions that people are all in the same category. If you go to other countries, though, deaf people might be considered disabled there. And that could be because, you know, we've got this checklist that we're following, which they might fall under, but that's not how people consider themselves. So it's important to understand the difference between those two.
I think that's a really important conversation about, you know, how everyone decides to identify and everything, and a really interesting conversation just within the disabled community as well. There's a lot of conversations about the word disabled, you know, and using person first language. We've really kind of pushed that, you know, we want to put the person before the disability, but in reality that's kind of going along the lines of impairment. It's assuming that that person's broken. And for me, like, you know, like we talked about earlier, like, there's nothing wrong with my body. Yes, I have an injury and I use a wheelchair to get around. But if the world is built for me, then I can get around just fine. Like, I don't have barriers. It's the barriers that are the problem. It's not my body. And so that's an interesting conversation. I think Cara and I have talked about a little bit on our own, but you know, how the deaf community fits in with disabled community. And I think there's a lot of people in different communities that we see under that umbrella that also don't identify as disabled. And for myself, it was a lot of like taking back the word disabled. And I think it's happening within the community a lot, and looking at it as more of a fact, and that it's really calling out the barrier that exists. It's not necessarily calling out my body. And so trying to work on that language within society. It's more of a descriptor of the fact that there are barriers and that I need accommodations. It's a part of my identity. And so I don't put it second. Sometimes I will call myself a wheelchair user, or, you know, I'm disabled. You know, those are different ways that I describe myself. I would never put special. That's one thing with a lot of these language descriptors, is that they were created by non-disabled people to kind of soften disability, to make it not feel like as bad of a thing, to make children feel better about themselves, which is great. But also at the same time, we don't need to soften this thing. We need to look at it as a fundamental part of life. Like, it's there. So let's include it in the way we do things. And then we're not looked at as a burden or a problem, because in reality, it's not us. It's the environment. It's the minds of our, you know, social structuring that have created disability. Disability is completely created, not through my injury, but through the way we think about it. And so we have the power to change that. And so really trying not to look at it as a negative, and, you know, and seeing it as something that is just an everyday part of life. You know, but always, of course, asking people, because even though I am not a fan of person first language, some people are really offended if you call them disabled, you know, and, you know, just like I'm offended if someone uses the word handicap. Just an FYI, that's no longer PC. I know it's seen on signs for accessible parking, but let's just call it what it is. It's accessible parking, or it's ADA. Let's just be direct on what it is. Let's not use these other terms to describe it. So that's kind of my feeling on it. It's a whole bag of worms if you really wanted to dive into it, but that's the gist.
Language is everything. I know the two of you, you know, for you, the two of you, the most important thing you've mentioned is to ask the person and what their preference is and how they identify themselves. And reality is that we all have different parts of we're all in different parts of our journey. So some of us may have been born deaf. Some of us may have been late deafened later in life. And it really depends on their exposure to the community. It depends on how, you know, where they live and work and socialize. And I identify myself as, you know, hearing impaired because I was and have grown up in the hearing community, where the thinking is that you needed to fix this. This was something that needed to be repaired. So I grew up always being criticized for the quality of my speech, and, you know, working very hard to prove myself to based on my spoken language and that culture. And later I found the definition of impaired, and I was just horrified and just demoralized. That I said, no, that's not me. You know, like Sachiko said, I'm not broken. So for me to get rid of that, you know, hearing impaired identity and focus on, no, I'm deaf, and lowercase d. But then later, as I became more and more exposed and around deafness and signing, and as I, you know, socialized with deaf individuals, and that being in the Deaflympics, I consider myself now big D deaf. So that evolution of my own journey, it depends on where people are in that journey and, you know, who they socialize with. And I really think it's, as you said, best to ask and not make assumptions and be respectful of their preferences. So yeah, that's their identity and that's who they are and that's where they're at. And that's empowering to have that, maybe not the right word, but label. But something that they need to be able to diagnose before they can move on, I think sometimes without having that label that I have to accept this, that this is who I am as a person. But for me being, you know, I consider myself now capital D deaf. And so, you know, I own my identity now. And, you know, I have pride in that. So really it's, you know, knowing deafness is not a monolith, that there's a larger picture at stake here and there's a spectrum. And that evolution is continuous, and the struggle and the brilliance of it. So really, but I think there's a lot of pride that we can have when someone asks us what our identity is and what our preference is. So we have another question from the audience. So what do you think is the right stage to include a consultant in the design of the process for setting up parks, for example, or architecture? What's the right stage to start including those consultants? And how would you find them? How do you go about looking for them? Let's start with Ashley.
Could you tell? I got excited. Well, I mean, I think that goes kind of along with what we've been saying, is that inclusion really starts pretty far back in the process. And, you know, before I probably would have told you that, like, when you decide you have a park that you want to do, you should hire someone and have, you know, design with them, not for them. That's been a big thing lately. That's one way to go about it. But as we're talking about all of these things, I really think that people need to start hiring consultants to help them just develop their procedures and their policies around inclusion and access. Because right now, the way the systems they have set up is there's nothing telling them like, oh, contact this person. There's no resources given to them by their organization. It's a really intimidating thing because, you know, each project, it's a new person having to find something. And so I would really recommend that people start doing the work from the organizational level, from the top, really talking with your leadership and how do we want to address accessibility? How can we make sure that it is a part of every project? And what kind of procedures can we put in place that will include that? And what kind of resources do we want to collect? And so that we have, you know, something that is like tangible, that like tells people how to go about this process, because otherwise everyone is just, you know, going about it and winging it. And, you know, it seems like really struggling, you know, and then, you know, you can also go and hire someone when you do have a specific project and everything. But unless everyone knows about that process, there's always going to be these projects that don't end up, you know, having a consultant on it and don't end up having access as a priority because the organization doesn't have it as a priority. So I would say there's two ways. There's, you know, start of the organization, have consultants come in and help you with all of that. But then also make sure you're designing with, not for. Bring someone in to actually look at your drawings and do a charrette with you.
Sachiko, did you want to add anything to what Ashley mentioned? Yes, I support what she mentioned, all of those, and I'd like to add one more. So regarding knowing, you know, with your budget and your specific deadlines for, you know, paying for the consultant's time and, you know, events or any projects when they begin, making sure that there's money available to support what that might cost, whether it's interpreters or other accessibility needs, providing budget line items. Often I think it's not included and then they say it's not available. We can do that next year. And then the flip side of that for me is, well, I'll see you later then. Like, that's not going to happen. It never happens. So we need to go back to the drawing board and have those conversations and have that commitment, that conversation regarding the commitment. Are you willing to make this something, make every effort to show that this is something that's important to you? And then when they try to dodge the question or ask for volunteers or, you know, and it's, you know, Ashley and I start to feel like we've given up most of the time, because, you know, we've tried to make that inclusive. It's something that we care about our community and people with disabilities and the deaf community, and we want to see them included. So continuing that conversation to make sure that people are thinking about that, and that, you know, it's inclusion plus budget line items specifically earmarked for those funds. So with accessibility, and then also thinking about inclusion, thinking that, you know, we can see there's kind of a struggle with conservation and with trying to balance that as well. So I'm just curious about your perspectives and how you find that balance. And we definitely want to encourage the audience to throw in any questions they have about that before we run out of time today. Sachiko's, what do you mean by conservation? Can you expand on that? Yes, let me clarify. So the land preservation sometimes is the priority is conservation of the land, and that's for wildlife or for climate change. So diminishing the impact to the land is what we're thinking about when we're thinking about accessibility too. With those lands, what would that look like to find the balance between those two things? It's a tough question. I realize that. It really is. So I don't know if we have that line. If there's any clear line, there's no black and white solution to that. It's all shades of gray. So thinking about minimizing the impact to nature. You know, what comes to mind is, you know, the trails, if you make them wider, that damages other habitats for animals by widening that trail. But I also think it's important to emphasize accessibility to information too. So going back to what we were saying before, leave no trace principles and what that means. Thinking about invasive species and how we can prevent those from being spread from area to area. Keeping your shoes and boots clean and preventing hitchhikers from coming in on your footwear. So trying to figure out, you know, from an accessibility perspective, and then looking at, you know, the trail and making the trails wider, I think it's important to consider, okay, I'm in a gray area. It's, you know, there's no dividing line for being inclusive and figuring out how to make that work. Ashley, I don't know if you have anything to add while I think about that and try to come up with some examples.
Yeah, I mean, my example is when we're talking about trail widening, and that's kind of the biggest one that I see being a wheelchair user and an adaptive mountain biker, is that there's a lot of resistance about widening trails. And like, at first I was like, okay, I get that it, like, you know, is damaging. But I think for me, that feels like a cop-out, honestly, because we've already, like, you know, cut into the land, you know, this much. What is it that if we do it this much? Like, really? Like, we're gonna, like, fight over, like, that much more space? Like, you've already done the damage. Making it inclusive just because your footprint is acceptable. Why isn't my footprint acceptable? It's that kind of thing. So I've taken a much stronger stance these days, and I'm sorry, but for me, like, you know, I don't want to, like, be, you know, too much by saying that, but at the same time, like, I'm kind of fed up with that argument, you know, that, like, why is your footprint not harming the land but mine is? I think that fundamentally is the saying that disability is too much, is a burden, everything, and not including in what our idea of the human body looks like, because the human body has so many variations that it needs to go out to the person that has the most needs. You know, and that whole idea is that we take care, you know, we put our standards for the person that needs the most instead of the person that needs the least, and then we should be working from that. And so, yeah, that one, like, gets me a little heated, and I'm sorry for that, but really, come on. And then there's also the argument of, like, e-bikes and everything. My bike has e-assist on it, and I totally understand, like, that will tear up the trails if it's wet out. And for me, I think it's not about excluding e-bikes, it's about education on them. So, or just clarifying, having signage, things that clarify that like adaptive e-bikes are allowed, but other bikes are not allowed, you know, or why they're not allowed, educating people on the conditions of when they're appropriate and when they're not. Like in the rain, don't take your e-bike on a trail, you're going to tear it up. And so I think there's a lack of communication as we kind of develop in some of these technologies around adaptive equipment and just other bike kind of mobility avenues. And so yeah, having more clarification and better signage will help with all sorts of accessibility and inclusion. But I think, you know, we talked about earlier about how making these things visible to non-disabled people, and it really is good for them as well. You know, they need to see this information. This needs to be an everyday thing for everyone. It shouldn't just be my life. You know, this is, we need to share.
Thank you for expanding on that, Ashley. Yeah, it's really, I think we touched on that topic too, and it's really, it brings up education as being so important. If the space itself is not accessible, then we're sort of missing out on the opportunity to educate more people about why we need to conserve those areas. So yeah, they can read about it, and that's, oh yeah, I get why it's important to conserve the land. But to actually see it and experience it and smell it and breathe it in and see all of that, it's just, it's so much more empowering to understand the value of why we do conservation work. And I think that piece is, there's a void in that educational piece when people aren't able to access it and experience it for themselves. We're almost out of time. I think we have time for one more question, and then I think we're going to do a bit of a wrap up here. And I wanted to let people know that we're going to have an afternoon session as well. And we'd really, if you enjoyed this morning's session, this afternoon session will be much more in depth. We're really going to dig into some more of these topics, and we're going to have a toolkit that will be available and some from disability consultation more in depth. So I think it'll be even more beneficial from that standpoint for this afternoon, and it's at 1:30. But our last question that I wanted to discuss, we really need more diversity in teams working out there. How can employers people that are working in the job descriptions show that they are valuing people, they value hiring people with disabilities? Really, you mentioned the word diversity. People often think, you know, race, skin color, appearance, and that's inclusion with diversity. But and disability, people with disabilities tend to be lower on that ranking. That's been my observation. But regarding diversity, really, you know, it looks like there's a common language where it says, you know, we do not discriminate against any, you know, people with disabilities, against whatever it might be. So that language is always in the job description, but it's always helpful to put in there that, for example, say this is position is open, like Spanish translation, plus we're open if you were fluent in ASL. So for me, I would probably look at that and say, oh, I would be considered a consultant in that area. That's a language need that I might be able to meet. So looking at, you know, depending on the description and how they write the description, are they following the standard language, or are they really showing specifically what they're looking for, like signing ASL or being ASL fluent? You know, we're open to deaf applicants, and being, you know, more inviting versus just saying they won't discriminate. So, and if you are interested in this coming for an interview, we will have interpreters ready to be provided for your interview, so the candidate feels impacted. That's very impactful, that they've already worked out those details before the person's even applied. And so leading up to that process, if someone comes along and is deaf, great, we're prepared and we're well prepared. So for me, that's one tip.
Yeah, I would say that we do not discriminate. Kind of little asterisks in the sign is never enough. And if anything, it's just a box that someone checked, and so that immediately doesn't signal to me that there's been any work done. What I advise to people, and I think that kind of the team within Empowering Access has talked about, just calling out that, you know, if you have any accommodations or needs, please contact. Like if you know, listing on the job description that there's like a 50-pound, you know, weight that you should be able to lift or something. Like for me, that's really excluding me, you know, because that doesn't work for me. But, I think a lot of times there's always workarounds and there's ways to accommodate that. And I think that goes in part of the commitment that you're willing to like find solutions for that. But just seeing that in there, a lot of people within the disabled community will immediately be like, oh, well, that's not for me then, instead of, really pushing for further answers. And so, because I think you need to realize, we all need to realize that, we've been discouraged from a lot of things constantly. And so we don't typically push things because it's just not worth the emotional energy. And so it really helps when people will list something ahead of time, being like, have a little thing to the side calling out, but if you have accommodation needs, please let us know. Here is a direct person to contact, and really just being upfront that we have, even if you don't know how to specifically accommodate something, that you're willing to. That speaks volumes.
Oh, well, this is beautiful. Yeah, I really have enjoyed talking with both of you. I feel like we could talk about this all day, but I will see you both again here soon at 1:30 Pacific Standard Time. And really, I wanted to sort of summarize our theme from this morning, that it seems like the best advice for everything we've discussed, really 3 themes: focusing on education, and learning as much as we can, and interacting and engaging with the education piece with diversity, collaboration and having a collaborative spirit, getting a diversity of perspectives, and then also in making that invitation to those communities to include them in your hiring, hiring people with from diverse backgrounds. So is there anything you two wanted to add before we wrap it up for today? Maybe we can wrap up with an afternoon dance. Oh, come on, guys.
Yeah. Can we somehow do the wave together?
Perfect. Really, thank you so much for having us here. And thank you for Steph for being engaged with this panel today and everything. Thank you so much. And please fill out the survey in the chat that'll be posted. So, and hope everybody has a great lunch, and hopefully we'll see you this afternoon.